All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever on the planet this wonderful webinar finds you, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you so much for attending the first of our webinar series here called the 10 Steps to a Scalable, Measurable Content Strategy. We are so glad that you're here and really just want to hopefully give you the best and most wonderful knowledge that you can get in terms of how you can scale and measure a content strategy. My name is Robert Rose. I am the founder and chief strategy officer here at the Content Advisory. And also you can connect with me, of course, on Twitter or send me an email anytime you like, and I'll be part of the presentation team this morning as we get going. Just before we get started here, just want to give a couple of quick housekeeping tips for you. One is to ask questions. As you can see in the chat window, we've said put your questions into the question panel. And any questions we don't have time for today, we will, of course, follow up in a blog post so that you'll get the answers to those questions. The slides are going to advance automatically, so you need not do anything but just lean back and listen to the show here. And you can download the presentation using the widget in the console that you can see below where there is the handout, and you can download that presentation. Additionally, a streaming archive of this event is going to be sent to you within 24 hours. So you'll be able to watch this again or forward it off to someone who might also enjoy it. And we're going to follow up in about a week for those of you who attended here with a larger ebook version of this presentation. So if you're taking notes or anything like that, know that you're going to get a little bit more than just the slides. We're actually going to send something that's a little more contextual as well. And of course, you can join the conversation. Hashtag us up at Story Helping on the Twitter or any of your other social media that you'd like to do. And let's get this thing going. So just if you haven't heard about Content Advisory, TCA as we like to call it, we are focused on three things. We are, of course, part of the Content Marketing Institute and really the consulting and education division of that organization. And we provide three things for organizations all over the planet. The first is, of course, strategic planning, where we're helping to roadmap things like content marketing, business plans, content strategy, governance, technology, measurement, anything really having to do with your content strategy. We're helping come in and plan those things with you. We also do, of course, our corporate education, which are 1- and 2-day workshops with ongoing training to help you and your teams get the most out of content marketing or content strategy. And then we have our retained advisory, where we're providing ongoing coaching, road mapping, or anything we can do to help you make the most of your content and how you're moving your business forward. And we've done it for a few businesses over the course of the last 10 years, and we're super proud of the work that we're doing because it gives us one real experience, real life experience to be able to see what's working in the real world. Together with my friend Kathy McKnight, we're going to be doing a wonderful presentation today on content strategy. And my friend Kathy is, of course, our VP of Strategy and Consulting here at the Content Advisory. Kathy, how are you, my friend?
I am very well. Thank you very much. How are you?
I'm doing great. Other than sort of dealing with the wonderful fires that we have here in Southern California and Northern California, it's a beautiful day here. I'm assuming you don't have that problem in Toronto right now.
No, we do not. It is a gloomy fall day, but nothing to cheer you up more than doing a webinar with a good buddy.
Well, that's very, very nice. Well, let's get this show on the road and get going here on the 10 steps that we think can help you get to a scalable, measurable content strategy. And this is meant to be sort of a practical primer, if you will, on what we're seeing businesses do to really start to get organized and to treat content as a strategic function in the business. Now, of course, in a 1-hour webinar, we can't, obviously dispel all of the myths, and we can't certainly provide all of the best practices. And so hopefully some of what we'll deliver as a follow-up to this will help. But hopefully this gives you a good framework from where you can start to think about how you'll need to want to change your business to get to that better content strategy and approach. And it starts in 1967. And this is something that we have just seen over the last 10 years as we've worked with businesses all over the world about their content strategy. And something that is known as Conway's Law. And of course, Melvin Conway was a computer programmer back in the late 60s. And he said this thing that ultimately has become very true for businesses, which he said organizations that design systems are constrained to produce designs that are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. And what he meant by that is basically how we're organized in business is how we will communicate. And you can see this happening even in the way that we construct websites today, the way we create communications programs. Basically, we are communicating in a very similar way to the way that we're structured. And this is often taken as to be a warning that we can say, hey, listen, we should not communicate in the way that we are structured. We, shouldn't communicate in the way that we're internally organized. And what Conway was actually saying here was, it's not a question of that. He was saying basically it's inevitable. You are going to communicate in the way that you're structured. So you must structure yourself in the way that you want to communicate. And that's an important distinction when we start thinking about content and content strategy, because it's an important part of what we see as the fundamental missing link of a great, scalable, measurable content strategy. Content ultimately is the experience that we're trying to create. We are trying to create these immersive experiences for customers all over the buyer's journey. And how well a business communicates is in direct correlation with how much importance it puts on the strategy of content. And we've just seen this time and time again. Those that are really succeeding with this put a strategic level of importance on content as a functional part of their business. Now, what's the challenge with that? Well, as part of us being part of Content Marketing Institute, we, of course, do our research every single year to think about what's going on in content. And we've just released, by the way, our 2020 version of this research. And what we find is something very fascinating, is that half of us, when we look out and say, what's the status of content right now? Well, we're a small group servicing the entire company. We're basically very commonly at a workshop or a consulting engagement we'll have a client come up to us and say, hi, my name is Bill. This is my colleague Margaret, and we're two people, and we basically service the entire business with content, with infographics and blog posts and white papers and all of those things. And that's not uncommon. So 51% of us are basically a small team trying to service the entire business with content. Well, then it isn't any wonder that only 41% of businesses these days have any kind of formal strategy for content, for being able to create content marketing at scale. And how could we? We can't have a strategy at scale because, quite frankly, we're too busy trying to create on-demand content for all of these different parts of the business that need it, because we're just Bill and Margaret trying to figure it out. And then is it any wonder that the biggest challenge that content practitioners are stating at 61% is we're trying to coordinate content production among all of those different silos. PR and corporate communications needs content, sales needs content, the VP of marketing needs content, our CEO needs a new PowerPoint, all of this new content needs to get created, and we're trying to coordinate and balance all of that across these different parts of the organization. So is it any wonder then 57%, when we said, can you measure ROI, said no or are unsure. Spoiler alert here, by the way, if you're unsure, the answer is still no. 57% of us don't have any idea of what ROI in content really looks like. But then when we flip it around and we say, what are the successful content practitioners doing? 90% of them are putting audience information needs above all else and managing content as a strategic function in their business. And that's pretty stark, because when we start to look at the insights out of that, we say, well, the problem is here. There is no actual business model for the organization of content in our business. Thus, there is no purpose or focus to the content initiatives we start. Thus, that means there's confusion on what we should do and how much we should produce and how to get it all done. And therefore, our default is to go to the lowest common denominator of the thing that we can measure, which is to be able to outsource our execution to an agency or a freelancer or somebody like that to meet the scale, and default to more sales-oriented content in the way of measuring things. And so our big goal is to, quite frankly, make the logo pop. And we're good at making the logo pop, but we can do more. When we see content succeeding, we see it happening in usually one of four types of models, operational models. And they're basically separated by whether they're internally focused, supporting a function of the business, or externally focused, building audiences that can be monetized over time, versus a simple departmental strategy or an integrated business strategy. So in the lower left there, you see basically player model, which is content as contributor. And this is Bill and Margaret. This is us trying to fulfill the needs of the business. And this is an important model for sure. But basically, this is us trying to fulfill content assets into the business as best we can and merchandise that content as best we can. Then there is the performer model in the upper left there, where we're actually focused on building an external audience. This is where we've got content as a department, where there may be an editorial team managing a resource center or a blog or a magazine or a event or something like that, where we're managing discrete, immersive experiences that are focused in on building audiences. And then in the lower right, where it is an integrated strategy, but typically also internally focused, is content as a service or the processor model. This is where we've got content focused in and a team maybe building things like SEO strategies and translation and localization and scalability, best practices, guidelines, guidebooks, those kinds of things, setting the standards for how content will be created and managed. And then finally, we see the content as platform, content as a business, where we can see even separate divisions of companies coming up. We can see separate departments growing up where content not only is getting created as a marketing tactic, but maybe an integrated business strategy to become even revenue generating in some cases, where content itself is performing as a business. Now, the key here, where we see success, because as you might imagine with any larger enterprise, you're going to have one or multiple of these models at work. So the key is, how do we integrate each of these appropriately, managed as a strategic function, where the weight of each of them is accorded to each element that we're trying to make optimal. In other words, where are we focused? What is our purpose? And which ones should we be building a strategic function for? Because that integrated model is where it really starts to come together and work as a scalable, measurable strategy. Just looking at it in isolation quickly again here. So for example, a performer model. This is Frontline Software, and they make software for schools, operational software for schools. And they set up an entirely separate publication called their Frontline Research Institute, where they provide original research and content and best practices for the operation of schools over time. And this separate publication operates and uses content marketing practices to build their audience and monetize that audience over time to provide those multiple lines of value, and is now so successful as a separate publication that it's now 32% of the company's new business. So it is an important piece of their marketing strategy. Or how about the performer model, where we're looking at somebody like the wonderful Arrow Electronics. Arrow Electronics is basically, over the last, call it 18 months, acquired 53 separate publications as a separate division of the company to operate them. They have literally become the media in their industry in order to facilitate education to their audiences, which are, of course, electrical engineers operating journals, websites, email newsletters, etc. Or how about a processor model? This is a wonderful one, of course, from 3M, Carlos Abler, who's just not with 3M anymore most recently, but what he built there was quite amazing. He built an entire team that was providing SEO, content management technology best practices, training, as he called it, the enabling of economies within the idea of 3M, to help them provide guidelines, playbooks, examples. So he was setting standards for how content would be created, managed, and organized in the business, but quite frankly, not creating much content at all. Now, when it works, it really does work here, because when we see this working, and we've done a little bit of work with our friends at Salesforce, they're actually building a complete strategy around how they're going to make content work in their business. And of course, they have the player model, where they're creating infographics and ebooks and sending those out through emails as part of their campaigns and creating wonderful content there. And of course, they have the performer model, where they have a podcast and a blog where they're trying to build audiences and engage those audiences over time. And of course, they have an SEO and a content strategy governance team creating guidelines and playbooks for how content should be structured and organized. And they even have a platform. In just about a month or so, we'll all go attend Dreamforce, where they've got a revenue generating content experience that, quite frankly, provides wonderful loyalty for their audiences. So they have all four working, and they're building this global content council, editorial boards, etc., to really create a functional, strategic way to make content scale and measurable across all of the different parts of their business. And this is important. That creation of that team, the creation of that process is really important, because what it does is that it starts to build a purpose and a focus around the way that we create content, the ideation, the optimization, scheduling, shared calendars, delivering and targeting to the right audiences, measuring and reuse. That then gives us all of the information we need to create a governance framework that makes sense, a taxonomy, a content structure, to make content aware, personalized, so that it's structured in the content management system the right way. And that then gives us the ability to create these immersive experiences that we can start to measure over time. It's that missing piece of creating that operational model that is really missing for many businesses, because we start usually with where do we want to go with our governance framework, and we just start creating processes to manage in silos. And that's where we get stuck with Bill and Margaret trying to manage things in a siloed way. So if we look just quickly at that governance framework before I turn it over to Kathy here, we can see this governance framework working across a couple of different models. So once we start to understand our operational model from a team perspective, now we can start to think, okay, do we want a distributed model, a centralized model, or something in between? Because the choice between distributed and centralized is a false choice. We can make the decision based on our understanding of where we want to create teams and our operational focus. So in a distributed model, for example, we may be in a siloed organization where there are different silos from products to functional, like PR or corporate communications, and it can work if we structure it in that way based on how we want to structure things. The pros to this are that there's maybe one or two people per group, that Bill and Margaret situation, providing content assets, etc. And it can be very easy to start, very easy to manage, nimble, and can change very quickly. But the cons to this are when we're trying to scale it across the entire organization and get the efficiencies of that scale. We'll have different and multiple persona development, for example. We may have multiple SEO strategies. We may have too many agencies going on. It is troublesome to scale this model. So if content strategy is a small part of our integrated marketing and communications portfolio, this can work perfectly well. Or if we're trying to keep our goals in line with a distributed model, because there truly is separation between the products that we want to keep, this can work. But we often will find that this is troublesome to scale to make a more centralized and get those efficiencies of that scale. That brings us to, of course, the centralized model, where we sort of bring everything together into a separate department, a content department, if you will. And this is also trendy these days, where we're focusing in on building those audiences and merchandising the content in a central way, a central team. When it's functional, there can be a high degree of control here. We actually have the team that will build focused editorial platforms and the end all be all calendar here, a clear mission and responsibilities. However, here we can often become dislocated from the other teams. In other words, we can become just another silo. This too can be difficult to scale if we start to become a separate silo that's trying to scale in that particular way. And that brings us to, of course, our typical favorite here, which is where we can bring integration to bear in a larger organization, where content becomes an integrated model and part of the fabric of the business. So yes, we do have a team, a focused team that is a strategic service for part or some of those four different models, but integrated at the right way. And when this is working, there are lots of ears to the ground here. We're scaling by audiences. We're managing the experiences that need to be managed by the team and letting other experiences be managed by other parts of the organization. When this doesn't work, it's because it's very difficult to build this well. We have to start to establish goals, governance, and workflows that are truly representative of this model. In other words, if there's somebody going to go rogue over here, off in another region or off in another part of the organization, it can really provide a disincentive for this model to work very well. we have to have arbiters of good. There has to be empowerment in that content team in order to make this integrated model work. Otherwise, it just becomes like the brand team, right? Where they're, only saying, oh yeah, that's what they do, but we don't really have to listen to them. Regardless of your model that you choose, the responsibilities of that team across that process is this fourfold. One, some form of content creation management, creating, approving, organizing, and managing these strategic content-driven experiences based on what it is that you're going to be managing. Two, merchandising content. In other words, providing part of that business model, that operating model of content. Yes, creating some of the assets that the other parts of the organization will need. Three, internal activation and participation. Maybe the most important part of having a functional team be responsible for content is to go out and basically evangelize what it is you're doing, making yourself part of the strategic part of the organization, internal promotion of content as that strategic function so that you don't end up getting siloed. And then ultimately measurement and insight, because if we're doing this well, we're scaling well, but then we can also connect these experiences together so that we're providing true, valuable measurement and insight, driving the management of the audience behavior across the buyer's journey so that we can truly provide it in that central way. Let me give you an example of this. This is a technology company that we did a little work with, helping them sort of map out how they would reorganize their content team to sort of address the new issues of the business. Larger technology firm here, software company, and they decided that they were going to call their integrated team a content center of excellence. So their content center of excellence tackled all four of the different models, with the platform being the most minimal one there because they weren't really ready for that yet. But player, processor, performer, they tackled all of them. And so they said, okay, our strategic editorial content, our platforms where we're going to create strategic content and be responsible for managing is going to be three basic experiences. One, our SMB initiative that we wanted to launch, which was going to be a new blog that they wanted to launch. The second was going to be our resource center for all of the different lead generation things that we're doing. So we're going to manage that like an editorial property. And then third, the website, where we're going to provide SEO services and some SEO oriented content, as well as best practices for managing the website. But quite frankly, the most of the content will be created by product people, by PR, by corporate comms, etc. Secondarily, they then said, great, now we're going to have a player model for 30% of our content that will be merchandised. That will be sent into PR content, campaign team needs, sales team needs for infographics, case studies, etc. So we're going to balance 50% of our efforts, our bandwidth, our budget for this team is going to be spent on this strategic platforms. 30% of our time will be spent on what we're calling merchandised content. And 10%, as you can see in the very, very bottom there, will be what we call a processor, which will be partial roles because we won't even have those. They'll be dotted line into the IT group and some of the other parts of the organization. But we're going to have 10% of their time to actually work on providing SEO and guidelines and playbooks and CMS templates for the rest of the organization. That's how they decided to organize their team and measure themselves. They can measure their efforts on the audience building across the new SMB, the resource center, and the website, and then through content consumption, the rest of the merchandise content into the rest of the organization. This is how they decided to set themselves up. Is this the right for you? I don't know. It could be 60-40, it could be 30-10, it can be anything you choose based on the operational model and your content needs. There is a path, however, to get there. When we're thinking about how we will get there, we need to cover off some of these bases as we start to set up the operational model and the governance. That's where I want to bring in my colleague, Kathy McKnight, who has been doing this work for a decade or more on how to start to think about setting up your content strategy and the steps that you take to get there. Kathy, I'll turn it over now for you to take us through the rest of this.
Great, thanks, Robert. Okay, so you can see here that there are 4 brilliant women's perspectives on what content strategy is. Next slide, Robert. There we go. So for Christina, it's all about user interface for web and digital, really. Rael, it's a business function. For Anne, it's about a methodology, a consistent approach and operationalizing content to execute against an overall business strategy. And then Rachel, it's more of a design thing. It is about how we use the words. But when you step back, no matter which one of these or any other definition really, whichever one resonates, when you boil them down, it's all of those things. You know, bottom line, it's a continual process. We as individuals who impact content with our orgs have to know what our content is and should be. So next slide. So first off, you've got to identify what the objective and purposes are. That's where you need to start. So is there a specific initiative that is getting you to define the strategy for your content? Maybe it's just something that you've been meaning to do for a while. But when you do that, don't only think about content's objectives and purpose from a myopic perspective, a specific project or product, campaign perhaps, but think about how it can support overall corporate objectives. What are those things that your company is trying to achieve? What are the things that it's seeking to change or do? And how can content support that? It's not a singular initiative, the strategy. Your content strategy has to be something that encompasses the entire organization and direction and supports it. This is how you explain your business, how you use content to do things like attract and acquire and engage prospects and customers and really build the business. And then for step 2, you move on to setting your goals. This is really why, next slide, this is why your content exists. Think about the goals that have been set, whether it's sales goals, audience or customer satisfaction. What does success look like? So what are your KPIs? Key performance indicators. Are you looking to increase subscribers? Are you looking to better your conversion rate or email response rate? Think about also some audience indicators, things such as likes and traffic and social shares, and do some analytics. This is when, you know, good old GA comes into play, when you start looking at your keyword reports, and do some competitive analysis. What are other organizations that you either aspire to be like or want to beat? What are they doing, and how do you get around that with your own content? This is about defining the value you expect your content to deliver, the actions to provide for your business, right? It's about thinking about what your audience, what you want your audience to do once it has consumed your content. So what are those calls to action? But in order to do that, you really need to define your audience, and that's step 3. So you can never make assumptions about who your audiences are. You really have to know who they are. Building personas is one of the best ways to do that. And for those of you who aren't familiar with personas, personas are reflections of the different types of people or your different audience, your core audiences. So it's like building a person. And in order to understand who your audiences are, you can start by actually interviewing existing audiences, whether that is through interaction, personal interaction via interviews or focus groups, but it can also be done via surveys, online surveys. Look to find out their demographics, their habits, their preferences. What publications do they read on a regular basis? What kind of education do they have? What is the problem they're trying to solve? Because ultimately, that's what we as content providers and marketers are trying to do, is to help them solve their problem, whether that's a purchase, service, information, and to do it better than our competition. So what is it that they're coming to you for? And what topics interest them most? This is the only way to be able to take an outside-in approach to your content. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, outside in means putting yourself in the shoes of your audiences and looking back at your organization to say, this is what I want from them. Quite often in the past, and there are still several instances of it today, we as organizations build our content to say, this is what we want to tell our audiences. This is the problems we want to solve for them. These are the products we want to sell them, as opposed to flipping that around and saying, what is it that they want from us? How can we help them solve the problems that they have or provide them with the information that they're looking for? This is about delivering what your audience wants and needs versus what the organization wants or thinks it should deliver. Now on to the next task. So step 4 is doing a content audit. Now, rarely do you get someone jumping up and down saying, pick me, when a content audit needs to be had. But for those of you who are lucky to be voluntold, there are numerous benefits to doing a content audit. Some of these include like weeding out poorly performed pages. Think about the last time you actually went through any of your digital properties and took away content. Things get posted and they live there forever. There's legacy content, things that should have been archived long ago on most sites. And this is an opportunity to look at that. It's about looking at pages that are working versus aren't. What's the difference? Why is one doing so much better than the other when perhaps you would have thought it would be the other way around? Validate your SEO, search engine optimization information. What are the keywords? Are you using descriptors? Do you have any metadata? Metadata strategy is something else that would come out of a content audit as a next stage. They can also content audits can help to streamline the operations of the site. So identifying what actually the content process should be versus what it is currently. It provides insight into the quality of your content. So again, giving you a baseline to move forward, and gives you an opportunity to look at what's relevant, what's really good content that can be repurposed, what's outdated that needs to be refreshed, or like I said, irrelevant and needs to be simply killed off the site. That's all part of step 5, which is the gap analysis. So once the content is complete, now you can leverage all that hard work and really take an outside-in look at the content that you need to identify things like call to actions. Are there any? If there are, which ones are working? Where are they needed? Looking at consistency of use from a structure perspective, your headings, your subheadings, titles, captions, consistent use of terms and spelling, and also looking at the language. So using keywords, making sure it's not a site filled with jargons and acronyms. We are all guilty of TLAs, 3-letter acronyms, and using them too often. We have to keep in mind that your most content should be written and delivered to the lowest common denominator. So not somebody who is fully versed and entrenched in what you do and who you are, but treating each one as someone who you need to educate and inform until you get into perhaps specialized area of your site where it really is for a targeted, knowledgeable audiences. And this is where you really identify the good, the bad, and ugly of what your content is today in comparison, thinking back to those goals and objectives of what you need it to be. Once you've done the gap analysis, now it's time to move on to building a message architecture. So really a message architecture, so step 6, is your blueprint for the content. It's the map against which all content is aligned back to. And it includes things like the key essence of your content. So what is it that we believe as an organization? Key principles, beliefs, a philosophy, and something that resonates against the brand. So what you want to make sure here is with the key essence is that what you stand for and what your brand espouses to be is reflected back in your content. It also is your promise. So what is the vision and ambition of your organization? What as a company are you promising and aiming to fulfill with every communication? The message architecture also defines your primary messages. So primary attributes as such as thing as who we are and who we are not. Keep in mind, it's not just important to know who you are as an organization, what are those keywords, but what are the things that you are not? And by defining what you're also not, which most companies don't do, it gives you a check. It gives you a secondary check against what you're writing and something to align with. Your secondary messages, these are sometimes support messages or proof of your primary messages, again, resonating and supporting that. And then your mission statement, your content mission. So for different strategic initiatives, you're going to have a different mission, a purpose for doing them. And it's a good thing to define those. Now, once you've done all that, and I'm not underestimating the amount of time and work that takes, you can now develop a more proactive and strategic approach to all your content, which is our step 7, which is taking a Dandelion approach to content. Now, this isn't as easy as the name might imply, and it takes some work to get going, but once it's established, content really will bloom and flourish, just like the dandelion flower in the field. So what this approach does, as you can see by the image here, is it starts with one story or idea, and not necessarily doing it one at a time, but a core centric idea which around many different parts of the organization can align. So the first thing that you need to do is to pull together a central editorial board. Now, this can be a formal structure, or it can be part of different parts of the business coming together as a secondary board. But what the editorial board does is becomes the master overseer of content, whether that is for the organization or for a division or perhaps product or brand line. But what it does is having that centralizes and starts to create a cohesive approach to content. Once that editorial board is formed, you now pull together different representation from the different content teams. And you come together and you discuss core ideas or topic areas that they would like to produce or generate for the next, whether it's quarter or half or for the year. And then people start coming around together from the different parts of the business to say, yes, I agree with that, and that's what we want to do. And therefore, you start building the content from a cohesive overall viewpoint from the organization rather than bits and pieces. It also helps reduce redundancy, which is a redundant statement in itself, but it helps by having people come together on a story from the beginning together, and not starting at different points and therefore duplicating the effort. Excuse me. So once the teams come together and identify plans, as you can see here, the gray circles are then the different parts of the business that then take that idea and start building it out for their own use. And this way, centralized resources, things like designers and writers, perhaps subject matter experts, can be more efficiently used. So you're not double dipping or triple dipping into having to interview the same subject matter expert or SME 3 times because you didn't have all the different parts of the business aligned. You can now do one interview that collects all the necessary information. Designers can start thinking about an aligned approach to the visuals that will be used across the organization in support of this topic. Writers can start building a bigger story and start thinking about all the different ways that story or piece, whether it's a white paper or a webinar or a blog post, will be used and pull together a complete asset that has things like tweets and shout outs and call outs, things that will be used through different channels as well, whether it's social or your digital site or presentation. And you get these refined, aligned group of assets that can then be used over and over and over again, creating ROI in the content production as well. Once that's done, defining a content mission. So our step 8 is, this takes into account the different parts of, Robert, if you can switch the slide. You know, it should align with the team and gives your organization talking points to your content. So again, defining the purpose and the focus for different parts of the things that you're building within the Dandelion. Think about who can satisfy the goals. So of a target audience, as well as from an internal perspective and getting the information. What valuable experience should we deliver to the audience? So again, a repeat of what I've said earlier. It's about putting yourself in the shoes of the customer, right? So outside looking in, what is it that the customer needs from these different pieces of content or campaigns or entire channels that you need to deliver? And then how do we differentiate? Because again, today we are working not in a market, no matter what our market is, about necessarily differentiating against what we offer, but it's about how we offer it. It's about the experience that we provide our audiences, and how can we make our experience better, more streamlined, more joyful than those of our competitors. And how do you keep that consistent with going back to what we talked about earlier with regards to your message architecture and the overall mission of your content? Once that's all done, now how do you keep track of all that? You do that by creating a content calendar. Now, the benefits of creating a content calendar are wide and deep. Some of them include a consistent content production schedule. Again, going back to the Dandelion approach, you can now look at what the different parts of the business are producing from a content perspective and get aligned. So perhaps there's a new product launch that's going to happen in different parts of the world at different times through the year. Those different geographies can now look back to the originating or perhaps second geography that launched that product and leverage those resources. They can put their input into this type of photography, or we need this type of video or asset, which again, centralizing and getting that produced, and then it's ready and there's no fire drill, which often happens with content at the end. It helps to stimulate new content ideas when you're keeping track of what everybody's doing from a content perspective. That's another opportunity for the organization to get aligned on topics as well as perspective by seeing what others are doing. As I mentioned earlier, it's about creating team efficiency and working together rather than in isolation. We often work in silos within our own little huddles, and by having a line of sight into what others are working on, it gives us an opportunity to collaborate and create better assets from a content perspective. It keeps teams accountable. If you mark it down, we all know we're creatures of habit, and as well, when we set a goal, one of the things that you want to make sure to do that is to write down the details of that, and having a deadline and committing yourself to something to which you are now accountable to others helps you deliver on that. So again, it makes you more accountable. It enables you to plan for seasonal content, things like company events as well as national events. Again, have that information, be able to reuse that holiday production that was done and worked so well the previous year, or if the company has a month that they focus on their philanthropic efforts, to be able to get aligned on that perspective as well. It gives you an opportunity to develop a more balanced mix of content from a format perspective, articles versus videos versus social posts. We are, again, human nature keeps us going back to things that we're good at. So perhaps we're a really good writer and not as comfortable in a social medium or in developing video. And by looking at your content calendar, you can see written editorial, written editorial, written editorial, and again, gives you an opportunity to mix things up on a more proactive basis and plan for that. It also allows for better accountability. We are all trying to make more use of the data that we're collecting, and by looking at your content calendar and aligning your analytics, you can actually track against specific content statistics and do comparisons, whether it's by time of year, whether it's content type, whether it's channel. It gives you an opportunity to be able to refine those reports and really do some studying so that you can improve the results. Oh, and the final thing on content calendars are only successful if you use them. Many a case we have seen, and Robert, while on mute, is probably laughing right now, where we have helped organizations set up content calendars, gotten them going, it's set up using the right tool, etc., only to check in 3 months later and it looks exactly the same as it did on the last day that we had interacted with them. So it is a habit that needs to be instilled. I would highly recommend that whoever's going to own the content calendar, you actually put it in your calendar as a to-do on a daily basis, to go in and check the calendar, put in activities as far as updating calendar, doing outreach to get people to update their calendar, and make it an accountability thing. So from an editorial board perspective or even a team thing, that is something that the team members who own it will be measured against. That helps ensure that it will get done. And last but not least, and probably one of the most important thing, is you need a team to deliver this. This is where you need to look at things like roles and responsibilities, accountability, assigning authority. And that's going to help move team members from very much what happens sometimes when we're all busy, which is, GSD, just get stuff done, to be more strategic contributors. So I personally, when we work with organizations to get their team organized, the first thing we recommend that you do is a skills audit. Building the right team starts with understanding the current skill set available. And when you do the skills audit, I would recommend very much not just asking teams what they feel they have a knowledge base in, but also what they're comfortable in, as well as what they're interested in. You may have a budding videographer on your team that you're not aware of, or photographer, or graphic designer. Understanding where people feel their strengths are and where they're confident, as well as their interests, will help you build a happy team, which is really important. So do the skills audit, identify the skills needed to execute against your content strategy. This could be a 2, 3, or 4 phase approach over a time period. It's very difficult to build a team all at once from scratch. So I do recommend that you do it stage by stage. What are the most important skills needed at the outset, and then start growing from there. Identify the gaps between existing and needed skills. So you've done your skills audit, you've identified the skills that you need. Now, where do the gaps lie? And then start building an org chart to distribute those needed skills. Where should they sit? Where can they sit? Keep in mind that skills don't have to sit within your team. There's other parts of the business that may have them, and from which you can leverage if it's not a full-time equivalent that you're needed. There's also, think about when you develop that hiring plan to fill the gaps, keep in mind that some of the roles are better or more easily filled by contractors or agencies. If it is a specific, very tailored skill set that, again, you don't need all the time, that's not available internally, perhaps that's something that you hire externally for or engage externally for. Or on the flip side of that, it is something that you need right away, that you don't have the skill set in-house, and you don't necessarily have an immediate way of hiring for it. Then bring in a contractor or an agency for a temporary basis. And not only can they fill the hole more quickly, but they can also transfer some of those skills and start building them alongside as you either train or hire someone to fill the role long term. Then think about developing a training plan to keep the team on track. We all thrive on learning. It's again, human nature. And by investing in our teams and showing them that we want them to improve and show them a path forward, you'll get a more engaged and happier team, and a happier team is a more productive team. And then make sure that you assess the team regularly, addressing gaps as they arise, providing training, whether it's within the training plan or external, as well as interest training. Make sure that innovation is part of the plan. Give people an opportunity to try new things and test out new asset types or delivery styles or channel management, and that way the company reaps the benefits of that. And then finally, because no 10-step process is complete without a bonus step, you have to evolve. So again, this goes along with the training plan, as well as the assessment, but also keep in mind all of those things that we talked about, from identifying the objectives and purpose, setting goals, understanding your audiences, building that message architecture, and managing and creating the content calendar. All takes ongoing time and effort, and should evolve. Your business is changing, your audiences are changing. Goodness knows that technology and channels change on a regular basis, and we need to, as content providers, evolve and adapt to those changes. And by keeping formalized of these steps and running through them, that will, checking back on them regularly will help you evolve on that. Robert, back to you.
Fantastic. We have a few minutes left for questions just before the top of the hour and our conclusion here. So would love to just take a few questions, and please feel free to put those into the question box. A couple have come in during the presentations that we'll start with here. This is one that I think is a really good one, and I'll take a shot at it first, and then Kathy, I definitely want to get your take on this. Which is, so the question is basically, we've done some of this, but we haven't done all of this. And so how would you recommend that we, where are the priorities? Where do we figure out which ones of these to do first and sort of get a existing process kind of, we're not starting from scratch, but we're also not necessarily mature either. And so the question really is, where should we start? One of the things that I think is important to note here is that from what I presented and what Kathy presented, none of this typically comes in a linear fashion, right? So we're either trying to merge and change existing teams into some new structure, and we're trying to figure out how content is going to be managed centrally or in a distributed way, et cetera. And we've already done, or some other group has already done, and we're trying to figure out, okay, well, whose personas are really better? Should we, create new ones, and all of that? It's messy. We definitely understand that. What I think the key is that if you look at especially as we've sort of outlined the presentation here, and certainly as we'll more completely outline it in the deliverable that we'll come back to you with, is look at these as pressure points. And start to look at it to say, do we really have an operation of content? And where can we start to identify where we do, and how organized is it? In other words, is it just simply something that has grown organically and just sort of is because it is, the institution has been doing it forever this way, and that sort of is? Well, maybe that's a place where we can start to think about, how do we bring those things together, whether it's a virtual team or we start small, we start very modest, et cetera. And then looking through what Kathy presented as those pressure points, once we start to identify, here's the way that we want to operate with the experiences we're creating across the business, how are we on our persona development? How are we on our content audit? How are we on these various areas? And just sort of press your finger on those and start to ask hard questions to say, are we doing this well? And if we're not, those would be the places to start, because that way you start to build a foundation. None of this really is about executing content and doing all of that. As you can plainly notice, most of what we've talked about here has really little to do with actually creating creative blog posts or writing an infographic or that sort of thing. It's mostly in the prep and foundational work we need to do on an operation to make ourselves really operating from scale. That whole idea of the content calendar, which is something we see all of the time, is a great example of this, right? We normally think of content calendar as, oh, we have a blog calendar, we have a website calendar, we have a social media calendar, and so we've got calendars, but we don't really roll those things up into something that could be used as a digital Dandelion, where we could combine those ideas so that we're working together, working at least in concert with each other, and then slowly start to build in a more centralized function. Kathy, anything to add to that, of where people might start?
No, I think you made some great points. One thing I would iterate here is that these are not, although they're linear and numbered, a lot of them can be done concurrently. So certainly setting goals and objectives at the outset is important, but a content calendar can be set up at any time. A very basic one, even if it's in Excel, and that can be then populated and expanded upon to include things like themes and metadata and owners and things like that as you go and define different parts of the message architecture, as well as doing an audience analysis. So I think just that to keep in mind, and as you very pointedly said, it's, most people listening will have some of this in some way, shape, or form. You may not have a formal content strategy or have a document that talks to content goals, but I bet you probably have some of that information somewhere, and it's about pulling all of those pieces together in a more formalized way, and can be put together. So something like a content strategy can include your objectives and purposes, your goals, as well as your defining your key audiences.
One of the other questions that came up here, which I think is a good one, and I'm going to pose this one for you, which is, so a lot of what we're doing, the question says, a lot of what we're doing is trying to figure out how we're, who's going to manage the technology for this stuff, right? CMS, marketing automation, content marketing suite, all of that sort of thing. The question is do you find that there are any sort of core components that can help manage all of this process, or are we still looking at, a bundle of solutions? What do you think about that?
I think for most organizations, if you're smaller, it may not be the case, but I think for most organizations, you're going to find that you need multiple pieces of technology to manage this. And that's not to say you need to go out and spend millions of dollars on technology. Things like Excel are an amazing tool for something like a content calendar. You can also track some of your analytics and do your reporting out of Excel. Then there's other tools, content management system, critical. I think having a digital asset management system, by the way, Box, Dropbox, SharePoint are not digital asset management systems. They are content repositories. There is a difference. That's a whole other webinar. I think are more and more important these days in order to keep track of where assets are, how they're being used, who has access to them, as well as relatively simple things like licensing, so that they're getting used properly. So no, I don't think there is a one ring to rule them all when it comes to technology, but the simpler you can keep your landscape and work within the capabilities of the technology that you have, rather than instantaneously going out and say we need new technology, is the best approach.
I think that's great advice. I mean, I think one of the things that I would just quickly add to that is the idea that, it's not necessary to use technology to set the strategy. It's rather much better to set your operation and your process and your governance and then figure out where technology fits into that. It Absolutely. Sounds kind of like a no duh, but it's one of those things where we often look at the technology we have and say, what can we do, rather than saying, what should we do and how will the technology fix that? With that sort of concludes our time with you all. Thank you so very, very much. As I mentioned at the outset of the show, we will be following up with an ebook with you through email, but of course, within 24 hours, you're going to get the audio version and slides, of course, of this. Hope you downloaded the slides. I hope you'll join us again for another webinar soon. For Kathy McKnight, I am Robert Rose for TCA, the Content Advisory. Thank you very, very much for attending. And remember, everybody, it's your story to tell. Go tell it well. We'll see you very soon. Thanks again for joining.